So welcome back to the Facebook studios at Raisina, and this morning we are joined by Foreign Minister from Denmark, Foreign Minister Kofod. Welcome to the Raisina studios,
Thank you.
and thank you for coming to Raisina. This is the first visit by a high-ranking Danish minister to the dialogue, and I hope you found this a useful platform. We're going to ask you a few questions, sir, for the Indian audience, but also because there's a large international audience looking at Europe today, and you are one of the leading voices from that continent. My first question, there's a big debate and discussion around the future of European security going on in NATO, the new architecture within the Union itself, the European Union in Brussels, and of course the tensions in terms of approaches of countries towards China and Russia. Can you give us a broad sweep of what's happening in Europe vis-a-vis security?
Yeah, well, first of all, also my own country is, of course, a part of the NATO alliance. And for us and all NATO countries, the transatlantic alliance on security is fundamental to preserve our security. It's what's not only created security, but also prosperity. We were celebrating our anniversary last year in December. So for NATO is a cornerstone of our security. European Union and European Union countries who are not members of NATO are collaborating a lot. And over the past few years, the two organizations, NATO and the European Union, has concluded a lot of agreements together. Is how we mutually can support European security. And also we are very active in the adjacent areas around Europe, Middle East, North Africa, because there we see security threats from international terrorism, also uncontrolled migration, crimes, organized crimes. So these kind of security threats are also there to us. But what we see is a deepening of the cooperation, but also that NATO and European Union are complementing each other on security, and I think that's good.
But what about the recent statements coming out of France? And I know this happens periodically.
Yeah.
This is French exceptionalism of its own variety.
Yeah.
But Macron seems to suggest that perhaps the time for NATO is well behind.
No, I think what many says, what I also think is that Europe needs to take a larger responsibility for its own security, not on the expense of NATO. Actually, I think the European pillar of NATO, so to speak, has to be strengthened. And that's also why it is important with the collaboration between the European Union and NATO. But European Union countries need to take more responsibility of security. We are investing in our defense. For the Danish part, for example, we are increasing our defense spending with 30% over the coming years.
And are you going to be meeting that 2%?
No, 1.5% target we have, and for now, but because we're building up. It is not only about the number of percentage of GDP, it's also the capabilities
and the quality of
the quality capabilities you deploy. Denmark is very active. For example, supporting the Sahel region in Africa, stabilizing that region, countering terrorism under French leadership. We are also very active in supporting Iraq, the Iraqi government fighting Daesh, Islamic State. We are very active. We will send soon a naval ship to the Strait of Hormuz to ensure the freedom of navigation, international law at sea, so our commercial ships can travel freely and securely. So we need to see that countries are stepping up and addressing the security threats. That goes for all European countries.
Let's turn to another kind of security. Let's look at the internal frictions within Europe, and certainly within the Union. Do you believe that we are entering a new phase of the Union, where you are increasingly going to see individual member states carve out their own foreign policy choices? With the rise of China and their 16 plus 17 plus 1, I don't know the numbers, they're increasing quite rapidly. But with the Chinese initiative, with countries seeking to create their own economic arrangements, signing on to certain political arrangements, are you worried that the Union itself is going through difficult times?
No, I think my experience is that the European Union countries, regretfully very soon only 27 because the UK is leaving, but the rest is very, we must agree that we need to stand together also when we are facing for example, unfair trade
Micah.
practices that we see that we have experienced. So I was happy last year when the European Union together adopted a new strategy vis-à-vis China,
Mhm.
saying it's we need cooperation with China. We have a lot of common interest, but at the same time, it's also a systemic competitor,
Mhm.
and we need reciprocity. So when companies have access to our market, the biggest single market in the world.
And you're talking about 5G and technology companies, etc.
No, I also talking about just, for example, servicing ports in Europe.
Mhm.
That Chinese company can do that. We cannot do the same
In
do the
China.
same in China. So reciprocity, transparency,
Mhm.
clear rules that apply to all. Also, when it comes to commercial activities, that we shouldn't distort the market. For example, with state interventions that are not compatible with competition law. Things like that is what we want to ensure. So Europe, we want to develop our commercial relationships with China, but it has to be on like clear grounds. We also want to ensure that the rule-based trade order safeguarded by the World Trade Organization is maintained and reformed also to deal with the violations that are sometimes of trade practices
Mhm.
that we have seen.
Let me look at another relationship,
Right.
for which has been a bedrock of European stability, your transatlantic relationship, America. Some would suggest that the transatlantic relationship is also fraying, it's flailing. You know, we have, and it's not necessarily just a Trump phenomena. It's easy to blame an individual and and gloss over, perhaps a general decline in the strength of the transatlantic relationship. What is your assessment of the future of the US-European relationship?
Well, I am very much pro strong transatlantic cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
I think in many ways, when Europe and North America, US, Canada, stands together, we are able to safeguard fair rules in the world. On trade, we talked about, but also upholding a multilateral order. Democracy, we share values that we need to fight for, that is under pressure in the world we are in. So I am very much advocate of a strong transatlantic relationship. It's true that on some issues, for example, climate, we see that the current administration in the U.S., which withdraw U.S. from the Paris Climate Accord, we disagree with that. We want to ensure and implement the Paris Climate Accord. So there are differences, but the fundamental security and transatlantic cooperation needs to be there. But part of that, you're right, is also that the Americans rightly expect that Europe will take a larger responsibility for its own security. So we also, on our side of the Atlantic, need to deliver on things.
And my final question on the political side before I turn my attention to climate change, because I think it's both an India-Denmark passion to change the way we are currently doing business and commercial engagement. But Russia, what's the future of the relationship of the Union with Russia? Do you believe you could have a stable 21st century without creating a sustainable relationship with Moscow?
Well, I think it's very important to create a good and stable relationship with Russia, but the ball in their hand. I mean, when they fulfill what we call the Minsk Accord, dealing with Ukraine in a way which they should, then they could pave the way for a better relationship with Russia. When they also help in Syria to solve that crisis in Syria, that tragic war, which can only be resolved with political means. If they help with that, we can have another relationship with Russia. So it's very much in their hands. I would strongly argue that we need a close cooperation with Russia, but it's not us who have made decisions which have complicated the relationship. It's actually Russia, and they have responsibility to come back on track.
So let's turn to climate change, Mr. Minister. Your intervention this morning emphasized, or rather I think it was quite a passionate call for action by all of us to respond to this planetary challenge.
Right.
Some would argue that even though the European Union is doing moderately well in terms of its own commitments, it is not punching at its weight in helping others achieve their targets. And let me give you 2 points here. We find that in our own study that the largest amount of flow of green finance happens within countries. which means that very rarely does commercial capital flow from one geography to another for a climate-related project.
Right.
So much of the finance is for your own self and not for the emerging and developing world. So European Union has not yet created instruments that can move large amounts of European savings to Africa, Asia, and other parts, which require money for building green infrastructure, green energy. And the second, the intellectual property regimes and technology is still flowing modestly. The most important technologies that can respond to climate change are not available at prices that are affordable by many countries. Is that a fair criticism of the developed world?
Well, I think it's fair that we need to work much better to ensure real investment from European side into economies, emerging economies where the needs are bigger. I think when we work well on climate, we have three very important components. We have the government who is putting the right legal framework and ambition. We have the business sector, companies who develop the products, technology, services, and you have the investors. And the last part is sometimes overseen. And the investors need to be able to direct their investment also
to these kind of projects.
Yes, exactly. And in Denmark, we have partnered up with, for example, our pension funds, and these are very substantial institutional investors. And if we do that, we can actually not only invest in Denmark, but actually invest all over the world in business development, deploying technology to mitigate and fight climate change. And I think that's what we need to do. So you're right. I think your criticism, we need to move faster in Europe, and it's something we're pushing for, a new European Green Deal that is also ensuring we have better, European investment in the world. And then with technology, I think the cooperation, Denmark and India, for example, had a long time cooperation. I alluded to the example of wind turbines here in India. You have, I think, now the 5th country in the world when it comes to wind turbines, windmills. And we started that cooperation years ago, but you are now very active in India and that field. So I think the right partnership can also develop that, what you are asking for. So but we need to do it, we need to implement now.
You mentioned in your speed curious nature of relationship that we can create, skill and scale.
Yeah.
Do you think that skill and scale, skills from Denmark, scale of India, do you think together, India and Denmark as partners could create solutions on climate, on sustainability for other geographies such as Africa? We have interests there, you are present there. Do you think it's time for us to expand the scope of our relationship and move together to different geographies to offer our own?
Yeah, and I also want to emphasize, even though Denmark might have skills, we have skills on that field on green technology. You have scale, but you also have skills in India.
Absolutely.
And I think some of the skills, when I also listened to your Prime Minister yesterday, what you have done when it comes to ensuring sanitation to
toilets to everywhere.
Exactly, or electricity, and there are certainly very important projects and skills that can be duplicated in other parts of the world with huge impact in Africa or in other places. So I think you're right. The collaboration is not only between Denmark and India, but it's also how we, and that was my point in my speech, could be global, like change agents all over the world, deploying ideas, technology, systems, political ambition with our partners in Africa, in Asia, rest of Asia, in Latin America and other places.
I think, thank you for your insights, Mr. Minister. We at ORF work with governments around the world to build platforms which can attract global solutions, and we hope to work with your government, your institutions, your think tanks, and invite them to our international platforms in Africa, in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And we are truly grateful that you have joined us this year at the Raisina Dialogue.
Well, I want to thank you so much, and I will really hope that we can also join a real strategical green partnership between India and Denmark. I think we have so much to offer each other and will be great partners for the future.
Thank you so much, sir.